you. More cases in the insurance industry together, and the topic of reducing value chain inefficiencies, insurance use cases. Please give a big round of applause to welcome Mr. Tom Manor, R3 Solution Architect. Please.
Thank you. Gosh, my mom usually isn't even that excited to see me normally. First of all, I'd like to, of course, we've been thanking the sponsors of the event today, but actually I'd like to thank the audience, take the opportunity to thank you guys because you took time out of your busy week, this week, to come and listen about blockchain. So thank you very much. And actually, let me begin by asking, obviously, we're all interested in blockchain or else we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be taking the time out. But how many people actually have worked with blockchain, either Ethereum, Fabric, or Corda, or have done any projects, or really know the technology? Besides a few R3 people? Okay. All right, so that's good. I had structured my presentation. I'll talk about insurance and the application of blockchain to insurance, but I also want to provide some context for why do we actually care about this? What solution is blockchain technology actually solving for us? And then how does it apply to insurance? And then later on, about half hour, 45 minutes from now, I'll also talk about how it applies to the energy industry. So let me begin first by establishing my credentials. First of all, feel free to connect with me via LinkedIn, via direct email, what have you. Because I'm a technical resource based here in Asia. Originally came from New York City. But feel free to follow up with me for any kinds of technical questions or industry-related questions you guys might have. The other thing I want to point out is that I used to work for IBM. I was a long-time IBMer, good 22 years or so, before, as David would probably say, I saw the light. I took off my blue sunglasses, came over to R3. And so I actually did work on an early version of Fabric back in the day. I also did a lot of data architecture and middleware architecture. So I come at this more from a technical background, less so an industry background. So let me begin at the very beginning. We provided a little bit of context about why we did Corda, what R3's role was relative to folks like Hyperledger or Bitcoin or Ethereum. But still, I want to take you back to what was the original white paper by Satoshi Nakamoto, which to this day, still nobody knows who that person was. I tend to think it was Carl Wagner, but that's just a theory. But nevertheless, in this white paper, he laid out this idea of some form of digital currency, a way to transfer value from one participant to a counterparty, perhaps in exchange for some goods and services, and it would all be rendered digitally. And that's very interesting. People are still excited about that. We still talk about ICOs and get hung up on them, maybe a little less so today. But in that white paper, as part of what he was proposing, the cryptocurrency, whatever transactions I'm doing, this exchange of value that I'm doing, has to actually be recorded on something. We have to have a way of saying that Tom sent Henry X amount of Bitcoin, and he acknowledges that, and that that's being recorded in a way that we both trust that information without knowing who one another is, because Bitcoin is anonymous, and also, once that information is recorded, we can't touch it. It's immutable. That's recorded permanently on a ledger. That fact is acknowledged, as it were. It's really that idea. That was the basis of the blockchain. That was really the powerful idea people took away from this. I mention this because you will still have people out there who talk about blockchain and say, no, you still need to focus on the currency. But people that really, I think, understand this really understand that the powerful idea was this notion of sharing data between two counterparties who don't necessarily trust each other. So that was Bitcoin. Then this nerdy guy from originally Russia and then Canada came along, Vitalik Buterin, and suggested, well, we could have this idea of arbitrary execution logic, arbitrary application logic, as part of this cryptocurrency that we have, still retaining the anonymity, still making it very easy to onboard, still being public. But with this application logic, if I pay you in cryptocurrency to execute this logic on my behalf, this can either become part of the transaction itself, or it can be additional information, additional application logic, even independent of the transaction. And so this became the notion of a smart contract. And so the system became more than just exchanging value from one party to another. Now we can actually do some execution of logic as part of that transaction. Why were people really interested in this? Well, of course, there was the currency aspect of it. But again, if you go back to my original premise that you've got the cryptocurrency, but underneath the cryptocurrency, you've got this more interesting layer on which we can record data between parties who don't trust each other. Now people start to look at that pattern and say, I could apply that pattern to other use cases. And that's actually a fairly powerful idea. So over here on the far left, back in my old IBM days, I used to sell you really bad software that would help you to do B2B transactions between, I don't know, one trading partner to another trading partner, trying to reconcile this using two-phase commits over a VPN, et cetera, et cetera. Very complex software because what it was trying to accomplish was actually fairly complicated. The internet comes along, makes it a little bit easier because now we can introduce email. Maybe we can do point-to-point messaging between two counterparties. Still have to solve for things like security and transactionality and things like that. So the software was still expensive and buggy. Now blockchain comes along. And now I have this possibility of having these two counterparties looking at that same data, trusting that same data, and then agreeing that, okay, this is a valid fact between the two of us. I have paid Henry X amount of Bitcoin, or I have sent him a shipment through a container, and we both agree to that data going on to a permanent data store where it cannot be altered. So again, this is the really powerful idea that blockchain is introducing. David had showed us this slide before, which is a bit of the history of where R3, but I wanted to touch upon some of the technical aspects of this. So again, I mentioned Bitcoin, and then Ethereum comes along, adds the notion of a smart contract. Around this time, R3 is birthed, and we start doing research into this space. Okay, how applicable is this to the financial services industry, which has much stricter requirements than, say, me just trying to trade Bitcoin? Around the same time, and I was still at IBM at this time, IBM looked at this and said, we think that data pattern is very interesting. Again, you take the currency out of it. We like the fact that you can have basically a shared database with an append-only operation. So thus was born open blockchain, which eventually became Fabric. We looked at that and said, okay, that's still problematic because counterparties can see everybody's transactions. So it's not private enough for financial industries, which have much more rigorous requirements than, again, maybe if I'm just sending Bitcoin to somebody, or I'm selling them a bicycle, or more importantly, if I'm tracking lettuce through Walmart's ecosystem. So that's the origin, the contextual origin of Corda. In essence, we were looking at the strictest, most regulated industry and saying what would be required in order to serve them and serve their requirements. And as it turns out, if you do that, a lot of other industries look at that and say, hey, that's actually useful for me as well. I kind of like that notion of how you guys focus on privacy. So we kind of talked a little bit about this in some of the other presentations. All of the blockchains basically share these basic capabilities like immutability, use of smart contracts, use of cryptography. And where Corda differentiates itself, primarily in privacy. Again, if I do a transaction with Carl, there's no reason for David to receive a copy of that. Again, because of who we were serving, of who we were focusing on in our requirements, we also looked at it and said, there's no reason to also reinvent the wheel. So if you've got these existing systems on CICS on your mainframe, for example, or you've got your SAP ERP systems, one, we want to be able to integrate with that. Two, we also want you to leverage the skills you already have in-house. So you probably already have Java programmers. You already know how to run JVMs in clouds or on premises. You already know relational database systems in SQL. And you already know message queuing. Everybody has MQ somewhere in their house. So just reuse existing technology because basically it's already bulletproof. It already works quite well. And then Carl touched upon this a little bit in terms of the smart contracts. These aren't just, as Ethereum would say, code is law. Rather, the law is the law. And so we want the smart contract to be as simple as possible, as deterministic as possible, so that we can look at it in legalistic terms that these are the terms and conditions of a valid transaction. So much so that we can even attach a PDF or Word file that in legalese spells out the terms and conditions of that contract. So we take the smart contract very, very seriously in that regard. And at this point, as David had talked about, we're already up to Corda Enterprise with the Corda Network about to be released. We just actually released the newest versions of Corda Open Source and Corda Enterprise literally a day ago, coming up on version 4.0 by the end of the year. So things are actually progressing quite rapidly, doing a lot of great, interesting innovations. One of the key innovations, I won't touch upon it too much in this talk, but we're starting to look very strategically at the use of digitized assets, tokens, and coins, not in an ICO sense, but actually serving a true business purpose. For example, transparency and liquidity of assets. For example, creating a corporate coin in order to move assets around my conglomerate ecosystem, for example, or digital cash from a central bank. So these are new capabilities that we're building into the platform to support this. So stay tuned. All right, this brings us to insurance, now that I'm about halfway through. So again, the problem that blockchain is solving is how do two people who don't necessarily trust one another, I may know who they are, but I don't obviously necessarily trust them, but how can we look at that same data, trust that data, agree to the terms of how that data is finalized, and then put it onto our ledger, put it into our database in such a way that we can't tamper with it. As it turns out, insurance likes those ideas quite a bit. Likes the fact that we focus on privacy, so that if I have multiple counterparties to claims, for example, it should only be on a need-to-know basis. Who actually gets to see the data that's going on to a claim analysis, for example. So, again, when we released Corda, the insurance industry looked at that and said, yeah, you know, as it turns out, that solves a lot of problems for us that we were originally trying to solve with IBM middleware a couple years ago. So, hey, Tom, can we talk to you about that? For particular kinds of industries, particular kinds of insurances, I should say, they have a little bit different needs, a little bit different requirements. So how a blockchain might actually help them differs a little bit. So for example, with property and casualty, there's certainly plenty of overlap between these different use cases. But I wanted to highlight a couple of places where we've either run POCs, pilots, research projects, or we have partners that are actually working in this space. So for example, in property and casualty, P&C, mostly around the inefficiencies around claims. Maybe not surprisingly that if, for example, if I'm doing claims processing, if it's just within house, yeah, I've probably got a built-in BPM system or document system for doing the claims processing. But if I have other interested parties, if I have other stakeholders in that claims process, or if it just happens to be the case, then many of my claims, for example, I have police, I have banks involved, I have other stakeholders involved in the claim process. Well, suddenly now you're talking about different counterparties trying to look at that same data. And I might want to control who sees that data. So for P&C, claims processing seems to be one that resonates in that space. Oops. Reinsurance. So doing insurance for insurance companies. There's a couple different ones. Claims process, again, seems to come up a couple times with reinsurance. But the complexity of the claims themselves and the settlements that are involved with those seem to lend themselves to possible blockchain-style solutions. And I'll talk a little bit about what one of the major insurance consortiums is doing around this space. But again, insurance companies tends to be a lot more complex than simple claims processing. So again, we find that blockchain-style solutions are resonating with those clients. Life insurance and annuities. Interestingly, we've seen when we actually talk to clients, insurance companies working in this space, one of their pain points is actually in terms of death payouts. So I guess in terms of customer satisfaction, being able to do the determination of the requirements required in order to actually do the payout upon death. Apparently it is a very complex process, involves a number of counterparties, and is a pain point for the industry in this space, particularly from their client standpoint. So again, we've had some interest in doing blockchains around these kinds of use cases. Carl touched upon this a little bit, the Corda Insure project. So this was a project we developed internally with a number of other different companies and got them to sign up for, where it's specifically around triage of claims processing. So if I'm setting up selling a policy from a broker who's perhaps representing a client, going through an insurer, there may be a reinsurer involved if it's maybe around catastrophic property loss, things like that. So just that whole process to begin with. But then if there's an outlier, again, if there is a catastrophic loss, for example, my home is completely devastated and catastrophic loss of home, well then there might be some external information that I need as part of that. We have what's called an oracle, which is a way to bring external information from outside into whatever the Corda process is. So in this case, it might be an oracle that's representing external loss data. The police report of what happened to my home, for example, or a FEMA report or something like that. But that would have implications for the reinsurer in order to compensate the insurance company for that catastrophic loss. So we're developing the business process to kind of proof this out. Can we do this on a distributed ledger, on a blockchain? What does that process look like? What are some of the hurdles with that, which is what we're working through. But in general, and again, we think we have, about 20 stakeholders or so, at least, involved in this. And again, proofing this out as a viable use of the technology. So it's currently in flight. We're currently working on it, so I'm sure we'll be issuing a report once it's finished. That's just an example of a pilot that we're working on, almost a research project. There's a number of examples of either partners, clients, or actual folks in production already, just to give you a flavor of how much is actually going on in the insurance space with Corda. And I'll delve down into a couple of them in a moment. So for example, the big one, actually the two big ones I would argue, are B3I and Risk Block. Now it's interesting because both of these, first of all, are large consortiums. Those are all the different companies that founded those consortiums and then the additional ones that joined them. But on top of that, both cases, they were already looking at existing blockchain technology. Rhymes with fabric. But nevertheless, they were looking at existing blockchain technology, also took a look at Corda. In the case of B3I, it was the very last minute, and then came away saying, actually, this is what we're going to standardize on, which was a very, very powerful endorsement. So you have these large consortiums of companies basically saying, we're going to build out insurance platforms on Corda, and in fact, we selected Corda over other technologies. In the case of B3I, my understanding is that they are working on a reinsurance project, again, around catastrophic loss. It's a little bit similar to what we're doing with Corda Insure, but sufficiently different that it's their own baby. And then with the institutes, with the Risk Block Alliance, they in turn are actually building out a platform for, in turn, building insurance apps on top of that. So they want to make it easier for people to create and port insurance applications onto this Risk Block platform. And they're also going to start to extend it to analytics and IoT, for example, to have that filter into this. So a little bit different use cases. In B3I's case, they're building a specific application. In Risk Block's case, they're building a platform, both on Corda. There was an Indian consortium led by Cognizant that built out another insurance network. And the use case was a little bit around, mostly around data sharing, facilitation of sharing data in terms of claims processing, in terms of customer onboarding. So that's a little bit more towards the, hey, as part of our insurance business network, let's share some basic data between us. Generali led another one in Italy, it's a little bit similar, where it's data sharing. InsureWave was built by Ernst & Young using help from Microsoft, and Maersk, the shipper, was the main sponsor of that. That's maritime insurance. So doing, as Henry was talking about a little bit ago with supply chain, trade finance, is part of that shipping insurance. Insuring the containers, knowing where the ships are, what state they're in, et cetera. So we have a number of other partners in the pipeline, a number of other pilots and projects in the pipeline. So some have reached full maturity, like over on the far left. Again, with InsureWave. InsureWave is actually in production today. Vessel, Henry knows them very well, a company based in the Philippines, I think. Also doing maritime insurance. Now we have another folks like B3I and the consortium in India, RiskBlock. They're in various stages of development, nearing production. I think in the case of B3I, they're targeting Q1 next year. RiskBlock, something similar. And also various other folks experimenting with different forms of insurance solutions based on Corda. In general, so one of the things I've been asked, especially if I travel around ASEAN, is, okay, if I'm in insurance, where do I get started? Or what should I do in that regard? Well, there's a couple things. One is you can, of course, do your basic research. You can do a pilot. You can, of course, come talk to R3. But it's also not a bad idea just to watch what those major consortiums are doing, because they're building out legitimate use cases. And obviously, they're going to report on them and what their experience has been with them. So it's not a bad, and there's a lot of activity in that space. So it's not a bad idea to at least keep informed of what's going on in that space. I can tell you that despite those basic insurance use cases that I talked about, there's suddenly a proliferation of things people are discussing that I wouldn't have really thought about. Not the least of which is, for example, loyalty points, customer loyalty points, tokenizing digital assets, things like shipping containers, tokenizing shipping containers. If you're going to insure high-value assets, tokenizing those high-value assets, maybe feeding digital cash into these ecosystems. So people are really, really thinking hard about ways they can leverage this technology and have it feed into the insurance ecosystem. So in summary, I think the obvious use cases around insurance are things like claims processing, basically making processes much easier, whether it's antiquated back-end systems, whether it's current claims process that has other stakeholders, things like customer onboarding, again, tends to be very process-specific. KYC, might be part of the customer onboarding. But again, anything that's very process-oriented or around the validity of records, things like that, lends itself to a blockchain-style solution. But again, people are already starting to think about things that aren't so obvious. Again, things like digital cash or tokenization, loyalty points, what have you. And again, the consortiums are leading a lot of this thinking. Even R3 itself, again, with our Corda Insure application. So the consortiums are doing a lot of this investigative work, a lot of this research work. So absolutely, you want to keep an eye on it from an insurance perspective. If you have any questions, if you have additional follow-up you'd like to do, please feel free to reach out to myself, Carl, my colleague Sharon Yuen in the back. We'll be happy to answer questions. I'll leave you with this final thought, which, again, this is some of the projects that I talked about, but most of these are live or semi-live in some form or another. This is how advanced this already is. I mean, in 2018, this is about at least 8 projects that are either in production, about to go into production, or at least in various stages of advanced research. So this is real. That's the key message of this slide. Don't bother trying to read the small print. So any questions for my last minute?
Thank you so much ค่ะคุณทอ
I
ม
guess no questions. Thank you.
Oh any questions any more questions please มีคำถามไหมคะถ้าใดมีคำถามชูมือได้เลยนะคะแล้วมีไมค์ไหมคะพี่ We have a microphone right Any questions
No questions?
Okay
All right.
Okay
you.
thank you very much big round of applause for คุณทอมค่ะ